How can a princess meant to unite two empires become remembered only for the stench that made an entire court cover its face? Versailles shimmered beneath 1,000 flames. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across polished marble. Violins filled the air with music, and nobles draped in silk leaned forward to watch their radiant king. Louis XIV, the Sun King, sat in the center, young, triumphant. The image of a monarch who bent Europe to his will. Glasses were raised, laughter spread like fire through the hall, and for a moment, France seemed eternal. Then the laughter faltered. A ripple moved through the room. A lady pressed lace to her nose. Another followed, her jeweled hand trembling slightly. Whispers sparked like dry straw, spreading faster than the music could conceal. The violins played on, but the harmony was broken. The golden air of Versailles now carried something darker. The camera in our minds turns, gliding past velvet sleeves and powdered wigs, until it finds the source, the Queen of France. Maria Teresa of Spain sat beside her husband. She had been given as a bride to seal peace between Spain and France, a living symbol of unity. But tonight, her face burned with humiliation. No pearl, no crown, no gown could hide it. The smell came from her, sour and unmistakable, rising into the glittering hall. This was not the glory Spain had promised. This was not the jewel France had expected. This was the rotting shame of a queen who should have been a bridge between empires, but became their whispered disgrace. Stay with us and subscribe as we uncover how the rotting princess of Spain became a living symbol of dynasty in decay. Under the painted ceilings of Madrid, in the year 1638, a frail cry announced the birth of Maria Teresa of Spain. Trumpets and church bells marked her arrival. Yet even as the court rejoiced, shadows clung to her cradle. She was the daughter of Philip IV, King of Spain, and Mariana of Austria, his niece. That union sealed titles and lands, but it also sealed bloodlines upon themselves. What entered her veins was not strength, but the slow poison of a dynasty tangled by its own pride. She was not raised as a jewel of Spain, radiant and untouchable. She was raised as a fragile vessel of a dynasty already rotting within. From her earliest days, she carried the marks of a body prone to sickness, a jaw too heavy for her delicate frame, teeth that ached before she was grown. The Habsburgs had ruled continents, yet their children became reminders of decay. And Maria Teresa, though swaddled in silk and surrounded by relics of saints, could not hide what she had inherited. Her childhood unfolded in palaces thick with incense and ritual. Courtiers bowed as she passed. Priests pressed blessings to her forehead. Musicians played as she learned her first steps. To outsiders, it was grandeur. To her, it was a cage. She coughed in the middle of ceremonies. Her skin blotched when others glowed. Her body betrayed her even as she was forced into stiff gowns that weighed more than she could comfortably carry. She smiled when paintings demanded it, but the court learned to look away when she faltered. Behind every celebration lay funerals. She watched siblings and cousins lowered into coffins before their names were barely spoken. Infants gone in weeks, princes dead in childhood. The corridors of the Alcázar were lined with portraits, but also with absences. Maria Teresa grew up breathing that air of loss, knowing she too might vanish in silence, another echo of the Habsburg curse. Still, she learned to perform. She folded her hands in prayer, bowed before relics, repeated the Latin phrases taught by tutors who measured her every word. She danced stiffly in halls that glittered with chandeliers. Yet the music was more command than joy. Even as a girl, she understood she was not truly her own. She belonged to Spain, to the ambitions of her father, to the fragile hope that her body might one day serve as a bridge to peace. Whispers surrounded her, though rarely spoken aloud. Her beauty was described with hesitation, her health with pity. Delicate was the word most often used, a polite mask for weakness. And still, every gaze reminded her of her fate. She was not meant for love. She was meant for alliance. One day, she would be shipped across borders, carrying the weight of Spain's survival in her body, whether it could bear that weight or not. The tragedy was already written long before Versailles. For Maria Teresa, life was a series of performances wrapped around a fragile frame, a girl born into gold who never felt strong enough to carry it. The empire she represented glittered on maps, but in her veins it whispered of decline. In June of 1660, the eyes of Europe turned toward the windswept island of Pheasant, a strip of land between France and Spain, where two great monarchies came to end decades of war. There, beneath ceremonial tents heavy with velvet, Philip IV placed his daughter Maria Teresa into the hands of his rival, Louis XIV. The treaty was sealed with her body, the marriage proclaimed not just as a union of two young royals, but as the very promise of peace. Cannons thundered, choirs sang, and chroniclers wrote of a radiant new dawn for Christendom. The wedding itself glittered like a theater of miracles. Maria Teresa, barely 22, wore brocade threaded with gold, her pale face painted into porcelain calm. She had never been outside Spain, never tasted life beyond ritual, and now she was cast into the heart of France. Crowds cheered as she rode into Saint-Jean-de-Luz, banners of both kingdoms entwined. To the world, she was a living emblem of reconciliation, a bridge between empires that had spilled blood for generations. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was just 21. Dazzling in youth, a monarch who seemed born to eclipse all others. His bearing was effortless, his presence magnetic, and yet behind his smile there lingered a flicker of impatience. For him, the bride was a necessity, not a treasure. To end war, he accepted her hand. To expand his glory, he would need more than a sickly Spanish princess. Whispers began as soon as the celebrations ended. On the night of their wedding, Louis withdrew with cool courtesy. He fulfilled duty, but not desire. Courtiers noticed, and they spoke in murmurs that grew louder with each passing week. The Sun King, it was said, found his queen unpleasant. The perfume of Versailles could not mask what lingered in her presence. Behind closed doors, the rumor sharpened into cruelty. The new Queen of France carried with her a sour odor, a failing body, and little of the vitality her role demanded. Yet for a brief moment, she stood at the height of her destiny. She was crowned beside her husband, presented before a court dazzled by spectacle. Europe, weary of conflict, looked upon her as the fragile thread binding nations together. In painted portraits, she appeared serene, draped in jewels, her hands folded with quiet dignity. To the world beyond palace walls, she was the queen who had brought peace. But in the golden halls of France, her fragility was already noted. Louis turned his gaze toward mistresses who glittered with wit and health, while Maria Teresa endured the lonely splendor of Versailles. Her peak was not triumph, but illusion. a fragile moment when the world believed in her promise, even as her husband did not. Versailles was a palace designed to dazzle, but for Maria Teresa it became a gilded prison. The Sun King filled its endless halls with fetes, masks, and gardens carved into geometry. Yet in the center of that brilliance, the Queen was left to drift like a shadow no one wished to acknowledge. Louis was never cruel in words, rarely sharp in gesture, but his absence spoke more loudly than anything he might have said. He surrounded himself with mistresses whose wit and beauty sparkled like the jewels he showered upon them. Beside them, Maria Teresa seemed a relic, tolerated but unloved. The courtiers saw it, and they learned quickly where to bow and where to laugh. When the Queen entered a chamber, silence followed not in reverence but in discomfort. Servants opened windows behind her. Scribes recorded in their diaries that her presence required fresh air. In every hall, the whispers carried not her name but her stench. No pamphlet would ever dare speak it. No chronicle would preserve it openly. Yet in the private notes of courtiers and the murmurs of salons, the truth spread like smoke. The Queen of France was a figure of embarrassment. She tried to fulfill her role, appearing dutifully at religious processions, giving birth to heirs, though most of her children died in infancy, presenting herself beside the king during formal ceremonies. Yet even in moments of triumph, her husband's gaze slid away, fixed upon another woman standing at the edge of the crowd. For Maria Teresa, each event was a performance where her costume glittered, but her soul remained hidden and humiliated. What must it have been like to walk through Versailles and see eyes turn not with respect, but with polite pity? She was queen, yet treated as though she carried an invisible wound that no crown could disguise. Those who stood closest never voiced cruelty outright, but the distance in their glances was harsher than words. They smiled to her face and mocked in private, never daring to cross the Sun King, but always ready to use his coldness as a mirror for their own. The palace itself became complicit. The golden galleries, so often filled with perfume and candle smoke, seemed to recoil. She withdrew more often into her private rooms, where Spanish ladies in waiting tried to preserve fragments of dignity. They whispered prayers with her, brought news from home, reminded her that she was still daughter of a king. Yet even in their kindness, there was a boundary. They too smelled what others smelled, and though they loved her, they could not shield her from the silent verdict of a court that worshipped beauty and despised weakness. Louis visited rarely, fulfilling duty when appearances demanded, but his life was elsewhere. The Queen, meanwhile, clung to her faith, spending long hours in chapels, her lips moving over rosaries, eyes fixed on saints who seemed far removed from the glitter and cruelty around her. She found comfort in ritual, in silence, in the memory of Spain's solemn ceremonies. But even prayer could not erase the sting of Versailles. Thus her isolation grew, not in a dramatic exile, but in a steady, suffocating neglect. She was not banished. She was simply left behind. And in the palace that defined magnificence for Europe, Maria Teresa became a ghost within her own lifetime. Illness crept through her body like a patient predator, claiming her not in sudden violence but in a slow decay that all of Versailles could witness. Maria Teresa's teeth blackened with infection until her breath carried the sting of rot. Her skin erupted with sores that ointments could not soothe. Each day seemed to peel away another fragment of dignity, leaving her weaker, smaller, diminished before the gaze of a court that worshipped beauty. The humiliation did not stay confined to gilded walls. It slipped into pamphlets and gossip, down corridors and across taverns, until the Queen of France was whispered about as if she were a cautionary tale. Nicknames, cruel and unrelenting, attached themselves to her like shackles. The daughter of a king, the bride who had once sealed peace between empires, became instead an object of ridicule in a kingdom where women vied for the Sun King's attention. Maria Teresa was remembered not for her crown, but for the scent of sickness that followed her. The physical pain was constant. Chewing became an ordeal, her jaw throbbing from infection. Fever left her sweating and shivering by turns, her skin pale against the velvet pillows that propped her up. Physicians muttered about remedies, brought potions, drained blood, but nothing restored her. Instead, she withdrew deeper into her chambers, retreating behind heavy curtains, the air inside thick and stale. In those rooms, silence grew. She surrounded herself with portraits of her lost children, tiny faces frozen in oils and pastels, infants who had lived only days or months before slipping away. She touched their images with trembling fingers, whispered prayers in Spanish, and clutched rosaries until her knuckles ached. These private rituals were all that anchored her. To the outside world, she remained queen, but in truth she was already living among ghosts. The mind followed where the body led. Isolation twisted her thoughts into grief. At times she sat for hours without speaking, her eyes fixed on nothing, as if waiting for the walls themselves to close in. At other times she wept openly, unashamed before the few attendants who remained loyal. They comforted her, but they too knew that Versailles had judged. Once the court turned its gaze away, no amount of prayer or ceremony could restore what had been lost. Time slowed inside those rooms. Days passed like heavy stones dropping one by one. Outside, Versailles glittered with fireworks and laughter, but within her chambers the hours stretched long and airless. It was as if the Sun King's palace, so radiant in its outward display, had hidden within it a chamber of shadows where one woman's decline was quietly devoured. Maria Teresa endured it in silence, though the silence was not her choice. It was imposed upon her by neglect, by shame, by a court that had decided she was no longer worthy of its gaze. And so her story at Versailles became not of glory, not of power, but of slow erasure, as her body crumbled and her spirit dissolved beneath the weight of humiliation. It was the summer of 1683, and Versailles still glittered with endless feasts. But on one evening, inside a chamber lit not by chandeliers, but by a few weary candles, the Queen of France sat hunched at a table. Maria Teresa's body was already broken, her breath shallow, her limbs heavy as stone. Servants tried to coax her to sip wine, a gesture of life in the middle of decay. She lifted the cup, her hand trembling as if the vessel weighed more than she could bear. The ruby liquid slipped over the rim, staining the silk of her gown in a dark red bloom. A sour odor rose into the air, so thick that attendants stepped back in discomfort. The queen tried again to raise the cup, but her fingers failed. The glass slid from her grasp, striking the stone floor. The sound echoed sharply, far louder than it should have been, as though the palace itself were listening. Shards scattered, the liquid spreading in a pool that caught the candlelight. In that moment, the silence of Versailles pressed closer, heavier than the music and fireworks outside. Those who stood by her bed did not speak. They could not call for the king, for he was far away in both body and spirit. They could not summon the court, for the court had long abandoned her. Instead, they shifted nervously, eyes lowered, unwilling to breathe in the stench that clung to the air. Maria Teresa sank back into her chair, then to her bed, her chest rising with shallow gasps. Hours passed like grains of sand falling one by one, until the rhythm ceased. There were no great prayers, no triumphant chorus, no crowds of courtiers rushing forward to kiss her hand. Her death arrived quietly, in the same solitude that had defined her life in Versailles. The chamber remained shut, its heavy curtains drawn against the light of morning. Outside, fountains splashed in their endless rhythm. The palace carried on, and Louis XIV prepared for another day as if nothing had changed. What lingered was the sound of the broken cup, a final note that seemed to mark her departure. In that ringing silence, Maria Teresa slipped away, not as a queen celebrated, but as a woman consumed by neglect, leaving behind little more than whispers and the memory of a scent that haunted every hall she touched. She died in July of 1683, her body closing a chapter that Versailles had long pretended was already finished. Maria Teresa of Spain, Queen of France, passed into silence at the age of 44. History could have remembered her as the woman whose marriage ended a war, the queen whose presence secured peace between Spain and France. Instead, she was remembered in hushed tones as the rotting princess, a figure of ridicule more than reverence, a woman whose presence seemed to sour the splendor of the Sun King's court. Louis XIV continued to blaze across Europe with victories, gardens, and monuments. He staged wars, plays, and parades, presenting himself as eternal, while his queen's memory was quietly pushed aside. In portraits, he stood alone or flanked by mistresses, not by the wife who had once crossed a border to seal his throne with legitimacy. Yet her absence did not erase her. It left a whisper, an aftertaste, an uncomfortable reminder that beneath the gold leaf and marble, the body of the monarchy was never immune to rot. Versailles itself became the symbol. Its throne gleamed in candlelight. Its galleries reflected endless power. Its fountains sang of control over nature. But beneath those surfaces lingered a shadow. Maria Teresa's life and death were not simply personal tragedy. They were a warning, the embodiment of what happens when dynasties consume themselves, when appearances become more valuable than truth, when a queen becomes a vessel of shame rather than a figure of honor. So her story survives, not in triumph, but in caution. The court of France chose to forget her, but in forgetting, they left behind a silence that speaks louder than their words. She remains the queen whose body betrayed her, the bride who was meant to heal an empire and instead revealed its decay. If a princess could carry the stench of an empire's downfall, how many other royal tales rot beneath the surface? Stay with us and subscribe as we uncover them.